General Committee meeting today. My name is Michael Link. I'm the Vice Chair of our committee. I welcome you on behalf of the Chairman of the Third Committee Leadership. And I ask you to take your seats. I call the meeting of the General Committee on Democracy, Human Rights and Humanitarian Questions to order. Colleagues, the agenda for this meeting has been distributed to you. Could I please invite you to adopt the agenda? Are there any objections to our agenda? Not as far as I see. The agenda is adopted. Does anyone wish to speak against the draft agenda for today's meeting? Today, as you know, we have the report by our rapporteur, the general debate, and beginning with the amendments to the report. I don't see that, so also the adoption of today's agenda is also adopted. Well, it's a pleasure for me as Vice Chair of the Committee on Democracy, Human Rights and Humanitarian Questions to welcome you to this meeting. You see me here instead of our chair, Suren Meborgne, our colleague from France. Unfortunately, well, as we all know in politics and in political life is competition. Election is the very, very day where we have to stand in front of the voters. And unfortunately, Suren has not been re-elected in her constituency in France 2 weeks ago. We had an excellent cooperation in this committee on the board, and I want to say that also, but he will do that as well, of course, himself later on behalf of our rapporteur, dear Johan Büser, our rapporteur in the committee. I will briefly report later on what we did as committee in these years, but she cannot be here today, and therefore it's my duty and honor to chair this meeting on behalf of our chair today. Of course, I would also like to introduce and thank those sitting next to me. In addition to our rapporteur, Johan Büser, of course, it is our Deputy Secretary General of the OSCE EPA, Andreas Baker, and a clerk from the United Kingdom House of Lords, which is a special privilege for us, Mr. Alistair Love. They will be assisting the committee meetings which we have, but before we begin, can I ask anyone speaking from a prepared text later on to hand it to the Secretariat in advance. Helping the interpreters in this way will make our meetings much more productive and efficient. May I remind you as well that the election of committee officers for the 13th annual session of the Assembly will take place during the committee's final session, which is likely to take place on Tuesday morning. Nominations for candidates for election should be handed into the table office no later than the start of that meeting, that is 11:30 a.m. on Tuesday morning. This committee is scheduled to have 4 meetings during the session, 1 today, 2 tomorrow, and 1 on Tuesday. First, today, as we already adopted, we have to begin our work with the report and draft resolution prepared by our rapporteur, Johan Büser, on the theme of this year's annual session, Human Security for All as a Basis for European Security. We are having 16 amendments which have been tabled to the draft resolution. Well, we don't know exactly how far we will get today, but we will begin with the report, then the general debate, and then we will begin with the amendments, looking how far we can get, then continuing tomorrow morning with the rest of the amendments, before we then come to the 3 supplementary items which have been attributed to our committee. And I remind you that the 3 supplementary items which have been tasked to our committee are the following ones: the draft resolution on combating violence against women, journalists and politicians, proposed by Ms. Hedy Fry from Canada. Then we have the draft resolution on the importance of the human dimension in the context of current threats to security in the OSCE area stemming from the Russian aggression against Ukraine, proposed by our colleague Bierecki from Poland. Then we have the draft resolution on ensuring the safety of journalists in conflict zones, proposed by our most esteemed colleague Whittingdale from the United Kingdom. This is the 3 supplementary items attributed to us. If there is any uncertainty, unclarity about where the others have been attributed to the other committees, please, we can clarify that, but this is the 3 ones attributed by the Standing Committee to us. I think I see no additional remarks or requests, but that has anyway already been adopted. 4 amendments have been proposed to the supplementary item, the importance of the human dimension in the context of current threats to security in the OSCE area stemming from the Russian aggression. These supplementary items will be considered after we have finished our work on the report and draft resolution. That is probably tomorrow. Well, before moving on the draft report and resolution, I would like to briefly, very briefly, have some opening remarks on behalf of the work of the committee. As we are re-electing the leadership of the committee, I think it's time to report to you that and what we have done in the last years. And well, you know, because of COVID, certainly our work has been very different than usually. Our usual meetings in the summer could not happen, and also a lot of the travel which we normally do was very much complicated. Nevertheless, we have tried by partially individual visits, digital meetings and others to do our work as much as possible. And I think it was important, therefore, also to be active with statements, with press statements. We have been and we have tried to be very, very clear on the existing threats for human rights in many areas. And so, dear colleagues, well, they didn't become less. We have to be very concerned on the state of human rights in many participating states, and we tried to the best of our abilities to address that. Yes, at times this has meant speaking out publicly in cases in which we see concerning trends, extremely dangerous trends for human rights. First and foremost, we have clearly and repeatedly expressed our concern about the impacts of the war caused by Russia's unprovoked invasion of Ukraine. This is a war which has certainly changed not only a lot for the people of Ukraine, which is threatened in its state integrity and in the life of its population, but also for the OSCE as a whole. Yes, and certainly we also did address other conflicts, partially forgotten, partially not mentioned enough. Let me briefly only mention the still existing suppression of human rights to an unprecedented degree in Belarus. This is something what Lukashenko certainly wanted, that we don't speak so much about that, but it's our duty to remind people about that. Aside from shredding the norms by attacking Ukraine, Russia also in other places, unfortunately, had an influence of trying to shrink the space for civil society and human rights. Clearly, Russia's war on the people of Ukraine and its state integrity will remain to be in our focus also in the future. This is only correct given the scale of the tragedy and the abuses. However, we cannot permit ourselves to focus on this to the exclusion of other issues and countries. History is filled with examples of leaders taking advantage of a distracted international community to push forward problematic and dangerous agendas. We have therefore also continued to speak out on a number of issues. Among others, we have expressed concern about arrests of political dissidents in Russia and elsewhere, about shutting down of civil society groups, about threats to the independence of the judiciary in many places, about victimization of migrants, about challenges to women's and LGBT rights, about dangers in human trafficking, a very, very imminent and very, very concrete threat, and many more. We have also engaged in the international forums on various topics, including safety of female journalists, equality issues, and others, reflecting on this committee's work. It is unfortunately relatively rare that we have reason to speak out publicly about positive developments. Nonetheless, we were pleased to have been able to applaud the abolition of the death penalty in Kazakhstan, even if there were some very other concerning trends lately in January. But the abolition of the death penalty is certainly something which I think, that is my very clear opinion, should remain at the center of attention of this committee. Søren Moborgne, Johan Büser and I, we also visited Warsaw. That is one of the few visits we actually could do despite COVID earlier this year. Otherwise, we would have been traveling much more. The intention of this visit was threefold. First, to continue our strong relationship with ODIHR. Second, to meet with leaders of the Polish OSCE chairmanship to discuss their priorities in the human dimension. And third, to continue our committee's growing tradition now of meeting with national parliaments' human rights committees. I think that is very important. Our committee tries, we had a lot of plans, really to go and to reach out to your parliaments, national parliaments, and have meetings there. I think this is something which after COVID should be done much more, because such meetings are so important as an opportunity to understand concerns and challenges facing all of our countries. And I hope that such work can continue. And when we have been in Poland, we had very, very confidential, but also good, yes, sometimes also controversial discussions, because we should also address the different issues. We should also address the different views. This is nothing that should be put aside. No, we can only be stronger if we only also address these difficult issues. And we clearly did discuss it also with our Polish colleagues, being from the opposition, be it from the government side. That is part of our job. Indeed, we hope that all members of this committee, that they really are the, yes, let's say the champions of fundamental freedoms, and that they are being applied and protected in law in your own countries. With communications developing so rapidly, it is particularly crucial that we make sure our changing laws continue to respect the international principles in times of shrinking civil society in many places. And hopefully, so many of us also can get again back to electoral observation. You know, that is one of my, also in my previous capacity as director of the ODIHR, really one of the areas where I really would like to convince as many colleagues as possible to personally participate in electoral observation. It's our landmark activity. It is so important to shed light into all places, and it is also important that all our participating states, including my own, that we lead by example by opening up for electoral observation in as many places as possible, independent of East and West, because I think all participating states have this obligation really to always try to improve and to double check where we can improve. I don't want to get now too lengthy when I speak about electoral observation, therefore I stop here. And I therefore finally want to applaud our rapporteur, Johan Böser, for the report and the resolution he has prepared and which he will present now to you. Let me, before I hand over the word to him, that we have after him the debate on the report, first an open debate and then the amendments. We have a speakers list. The speakers list is already, well, let's say quite well, always interesting, but also heavily loaded. So please accept a limitation of 3 minutes to take the floor, 3 minutes, that would be the time limit in order to be able to work in, to accommodate as many people as possible. Later when we speak about the amendments, then the time limit will be 1 minute, but I will repeat that then later. I will inform you in time before we close the speakers list, but nevertheless we would welcome if you want to take the floor to show up as early as possible so that we have a broad overlook of how many people we have on board. Having said that, now the time is there for the report of our rapporteur. Dear Johan, the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot, Michael, and thank you for good cooperation, and thank you also to the Secretariat for good cooperation during this year we have worked together. And it's very good to see all of you again in the third committee after 2 years of COVID pandemic restrictions, and I'm now looking forward to hear the debate on the resolution as well as the proposed amendments later on today. So, dear colleagues, at a time when the OSCE is facing its greatest challenges in decades, ensuring that our democracies are inclusive, resilient, and guaranteeing the full respect for human rights and OSCE principles should be at the forefront of our action. Since we held our last annual session, several crises have hindered respect for rule of law and put our democracies at risk. On the one hand, governments were called upon to act and have taken vast and unparalleled decisions to contain the spread of COVID-19 and protect the lives of their citizens. However, this global crisis has also exposed existing human rights violations and inequalities with a devastating effect on vulnerable groups and societies. On the other hand, we currently witness unacceptable human rights violations, some at the forefront of our international relations, such as the Russian war in Ukraine, and some on which governments remain silent. The consequences of these crises are deep and will be long-lasting, both on the lives of all our populations within and outside of the OSCE region and on the existence itself of human rights. It is our responsibility as parliamentarians to take action. We have to raise issues in our countries and hold our governments accountable to support our populations in facing the major social and political challenges, whilst ensuring that the implemented measures will not undermine the OSCE's founding values of human rights, democracy, and the rule of law. Based on these findings, my report focuses on 5 groups of challenges which I have and I believe are keys and need implementable and democratic solutions. First, the massive humanitarian consequences of the conflict in Ukraine should be at the center of our attention. The abuses and the breaches of rights are almost too many to count, but start, of course, from the deprivation of the right to life of many. Civilian casualties continue to mount, and reports of violations that may amount to war crimes and crimes against humanity continue to emerge. Violence, be it through destruction, rape, daily hardships, or psychological violence, cannot and should not be tolerated. More than 6 million Ukrainians have been forced to leave their country, while another 7 million people have been displaced. The importance and speed of displacement are immense and have had a particularly dramatic impact on women, children, and vulnerable persons. The report and the resolution that I have presented are focused, of course, on the human rights and humanitarian aspects of the conflict. I am confident that our colleagues in other committees are also addressing other relevant aspects. I trust that our overall declaration will be a strong and comprehensive statement. Second, I believe the shrinking of the public sphere in many countries requires our dedicated attention. The multiple infringements on the independence of civil society by states and other actors affect our democracies and represents a problem for which we should find common solutions. This is necessary in order to ensure the preservation of basic civil and political rights and support civil society's role as an independent actor. Civil society supports the development of numerous values of democratic life. A democratic state cannot be stable unless it is effective and legitimate with the respect and support of its citizens. All of this means that civil society is a vital partner for us parliamentarians. Third, we are all aware of the daily challenges encountered by people following the pandemic and the growing socio-economic inequalities which have developed. Inequalities were deepened in the midst of the pandemic as a result of tough economic policies. Human rights and our democratic processes were all impacted. The world's response to the pandemic has led to a deepening of every kind of inequality. Minority groups have been specifically impacted by these measures because of their existing vulnerabilities. In this regard, I also would like to send all my support to the LGBTQI community, which was specifically targeted in Oslo and hit in Oslo last week. The recent years have proven that parliamentarians had a key role to play in supporting the effective implementation of human rights for every category of people within our society, especially the most vulnerable ones. As parliamentarians, we must engage in discussions to find suitable solutions to these issues and support the citizens who have elected us in order to give them a voice to make up for the lack of capacity or willingness of our governments. Fourth, Addressing the field of migration, I believe that the normalization of pushbacks within the OSCE's area requires urgent action. Their widespread occurrence and the resulting human rights violations should not be tolerated. When ensuring migrants' rights, we have to put the protection of human dignity and the observance of international obligations at the center of government action. Migrants face daily hardships and put their life at risk every day. I believe we are all aware of the death of migrants who were attempting to cross from Morocco to the Spanish enclave of Melilla last week, the worst tragedy of its kind, which invites efficient action and support. But this was far from an isolated event, and so require us to engage seriously in policy discussions surrounding this. I hope that the report and the resolution I have prepared move us into the right direction. Lastly, I could not submit this report without a call to enhance the protection of freedom of the media, of expression, and freedom of the assembly. The recent events in Ukraine and in Israel, where journalists were targeted and lost their life, represent unjustifiable actions which require increased efforts to preserve the integrity of the media. We have to remember that the independence of the media is vital for a well-functioning democracy, meaning that it is our duty to protect it and ensure that journalists will remain free from persecutions. We must continue to develop solutions to reduce violence against journalists, fake news, and disinformation, and allow freedom of expression in all its forms, be it online or in person. Legislative and physical violence against journalists cannot and will not never be justified. So, dear colleagues, as parliamentarians, it is our duty to find solutions to such issues which I have mentioned, and multilateral bodies such as the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly represent the space of expression we need for doing so, supporting suggestions and dialogue to reinforce our democracies. I welcome the amendments received in this regard and the contribution of some of the participants in order to make their voices heard and amend my report to ensure a better protection of the rule of law, of our democracies, of the rights of our populations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Johan. Thank you very much for your detailed report. And I can say, as we have been working now these last months and years together, it was really, also on a personal basis, excellent exchange. We wished we could have had more opportunities also to meet in person, but we tried as much as possible through digital ways to do that. Now it's time, after your report, dear Johan, to come to our discussion. We have a long long speakers list already. I will always read the next speaker and the speaker after that person then, and we will begin with, si je suis bien informé, avec un député du Canada, Monsieur Patricia Beauvais, followed by Ulvia Agayeva from Azerbaijan.
Thank you, Chair. And I'd like to thank our rapporteur. It was a very significant report. Colleague parliamentarians, I speak in support of UNESCO's call to respect international law and the Hague Convention for the Protection of Cultural Property during this Russian invasion of Ukraine. I applaud the efforts of UNESCO and the many countries and cultural institutions which have been displaying the blue shield emblems on Ukraine's heritage buildings and statues, and for their work in the protection of Ukraine's museum collections. Since February 24th, 2022, however, 152 cultural sites have been partially or totally destroyed in clear violation of the 1954 Hague Convention. By June 23rd, 2022, that destruction in Ukraine included 70 religious buildings, 30 historical buildings, 18 cultural centers, 15 monuments, 12 museums, including 25 paintings by Ukrainian folk artist Maria Primachenko, and 7 libraries. I ask for proactive international support for the Hague Convention for the protection of cultural property in this war. Ukraine's cultural property is important, the nation's soul. It connects global humanity, tying past, present, and future together. Destroying this cultural property denies Ukraine its history and identity. When the time comes, I will fully support Amendment number 3. Thank you.
Thank you very much, dear colleague, and also thank you also for what you said and for respecting the time limit. Excellent, thank you very much for that. Next speaker on our list is Ulvia Agayeva from Azerbaijan, followed by Mr. Kyriakos Hajiani from Cyprus.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, dear colleagues. The trilateral statement signed on 10th November 2020 between Azerbaijan, Armenia, and Russia has put an end to the conflict and set agreed parameters for the establishing durable peace in the region. Now that the war is over and the conflict has been resolved, the absolute priority of Azerbaijan is sustaining and consolidating fragile peace emerged with the signing of the statement. To this end, it's essential to implement effective post-conflict rehabilitation, reconstruction, and reintegration activities. The government of Azerbaijan has already initiated practical steps aiming at eliminating the consequences, including humanitarian implications of the decades-old occupation of the territories of Azerbaijan, accompanied by massive destruction. Large-scale construction work is carried out in the liberated territories. All this work is being conducted with Azerbaijan's own financial resources. To that end, $1.3 billion has been allocated from the state budget in the 2021. Almost the same amount is envisaged in the state budget for this year. The government of Azerbaijan has set in motion plans to begin returning the displaced families safely and securely to the liberated territories, including investment to help rebuild the cities that were destroyed during the years of occupation. Unfortunately, the high scale of contamination by landmines prevents the return of IDPs in safety and dignity to their homes. We look forward to the return of IDPs and celebrating the start of the new chapter for Karabakh. Smart village of Aghali in Zangilan district will soon be welcoming IDP families. Another track of the post-conflict reconstruction process is focused on restoration of cultural heritage in the liberated territories. The historical and cultural features have been altered and the signs of Azerbaijani cultural and historical roots have been removed. For example, some 65 out of 67 mosques have been totally destroyed. Only 2 have survived the total destruction, only to be used for military purposes. For decades, Azerbaijan had been appealing to the international community, including UNESCO, to visit the occupied territories and to assess the scale of unprecedented destruction, vandalism, and looting inflicted upon cultural heritage to no avail. However, deployment of UNESCO technical mission to the region is being hindered by one particular participating state due to its own political interests. Another humanitarian challenge emerged from the former conflict is the issue of the whereabouts of around 4,000 Azerbaijanis whose fate remains unknown. Elaborating on the need to address wrongdoings and establish accountability for advancing sustainable peace-building and reconciliation with particular focus on post-conflict situations is essential. The only way forward is to consolidate peace in the region based on the fundamental principles of international law and the Osce principles and commitments. At this critical juncture, we as parliamentarians should support this process and refrain from actions or statements that hinder the sensitive process of normalization and deepen the divides in the region. In that context, I call on fellow parliamentarians to support draft resolution as it was presented by the rapporteur. Thank you.
Thank you, dear colleague. Next to take the floor is Kyriakos Hajiani from Cyprus, followed by Christina Michaud from Canada.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for giving me the floor. Thank you, first of all, the head of this committee, Mr. Andreas Baker, as always. Thanks also, Seren, as chairwoman, and you, Mr. Chair, as vice chair of the committee, and also the rapporteur of Johan Buzel. I want to congratulate your team for the excellent and very professional job you have done in this whole last year. Dear colleagues, this year's annual session is taking place in a highly adverse security environment. There is mounting concern about the overall impact of the Russian military aggression against Ukraine, far and foremost its dire humanitarian consequences. Being confronted with such an alarming situation, we as parliamentarians must remember our commitments in the human dimension. Yet, the Russian invasion is not the only challenge the world has been facing. Our economies and our societies have seriously been affected by the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. Over the last 3 years, our democracies have been under high stress as human rights and fundamental freedoms have been affected in light of an unprecedented threat of such magnitude. Speaking of human rights violations, the people of Cyprus have been suffering for 48 years now, and dire consequences of Turkish invasion and ongoing occupation of 1/3 of the territory of the Republic of Cyprus. Turkish threats against Cyprus and Greece continue unabated on a daily basis, and unfortunately, it brings more tensions and instability. Another point is the need to further engage civil society in the work of the OSCE and our Assembly in particular. In my capacity as Special Representative for Civil Society Engagement, I have the opportunity to appreciate the valuable input of experts from the civil society to our work. In this regard, I recently took the initiative to organize a consultation call with civil society organizations ahead of our annual session. I was very pleased to realize that some of the ideas and recommendations raised by participants from the civil society have been validated as amendments of committee resolutions. I strongly believe that this interaction must continue and be further enhanced through more initiatives. Last but not least, I wish to highlight the importance of follow-up in election monitoring. A core part of election observation is the final assessment and the recommendation that we submit to improve the conduct of elections. Election observation will be beneficial only to the degree that these recommendations are given serious consideration and are acted upon. We must make this happen, or serious flaws and shortcomings in electoral processes will persist, casting a blow on popular sovereignty and democratization efforts. Thank you, and congratulations again for the report, the rapporteur.
Thank you very much, Kyriakos. Thank you for your remarks. And the next on our speakers list is our colleague Christina Michaud from Canada, and followed by Yasmine Posio from Sweden.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Chers collègues, je m'adresse à vous aujourd'hui pour me porter à la défense de nos démocraties et de notre sécurité collective. Mon intervention portera essentiellement sur les importantes questions que sont la désinformation et la liberté sur Internet. Bien que ces deux concepts soient distincts, le travail de la Commission effectué dans le cadre du rapport sur la sécurité humaine pour tous illustre la façon dont ils se recoupent et quelles peuvent être les conséquences si nous, décideurs politiques, ne faisons rien. De plus en plus, nous sommes confrontés à différentes stratégies de désinformation qui minent nos démocraties en semant l'incertitude et parfois en suscitant la malveillance dans une frange de la population. Comme le dit clairement le rapport, la désinformation peut porter atteinte aux droits humains et causer des dommages physiques, par exemple en incitant à la violence contre un groupe minoritaire. De tels préjudices sont inacceptables dans une démocratie où toute personne doit être libre de participer à la vie démocratique sur un pied d'égalité, sans craindre la violence ou les représailles. C'est une idée simple, mais fondamentale pour nos systèmes de gouvernance et nos croyances dans un monde libre. Cependant, certains événements de la vie moderne nous montrent que la liberté de participer pleinement à la démocratie est difficile à faire respecter. Cela ne signifie pas pour autant que nous devons renoncer. Au contraire, nous devons être fin prêts et nous défendre contre la désinformation sur tous les fronts. Le Comité permanent de la sécurité publique et nationale de la Chambre des communes du Canada, que j'ai le plaisir de vice-présider, s'est récemment penché sur les conséquences de la montée de l'extrémisme violent à caractère idéologique. Nous avons notamment pu mieux comprendre le rôle que peuvent jouer les médias sociaux dans la diffusion de plus en plus fréquente d'informations mensongères sur Internet. Au Québec, au Canada, partout dans le monde, nous ne sommes malheureusement pas à l'abri de ces nouvelles formes de préjudice. Il apparaît clair que nous devons aussi nous inquiéter de l'ingérence étrangère qui se manifeste par la désinformation destinée à accroître la polarisation sociale. À ce jour, c'est particulièrement vrai pour l'Ukraine, qui se défend depuis très longtemps contre la désinformation venant de puissances hostiles, comme la Russie. La Russie a mené une campagne de désinformation pour justifier son occupation illégale de la Crimée et son soutien aux séparatistes russes du Donbass. La Russie a toujours recours à la désinformation pour tromper sa propre population et tenter de semer la discorde chez ceux qui se battent pour la souveraineté de l'Ukraine. En tant que représentante d'un parti qui milite pour la souveraineté territoriale et politique du Québec, j'éprouve un immense sentiment de compassion pour nos amis ukrainiens. Toute nation devrait être en mesure de militer pour la souveraineté de son territoire sans crainte de violentes représailles. La propagande et la désinformation font partie des autres types de violences dont est victime l'Ukraine. La désinformation n'est en fait qu'une facette de ce conflit complexe, mais c'est une facette que nous ne pouvons pas ignorer. Le Canada et de nombreux alliés de l'Ukraine ont pris des mesures pour lutter contre la propagation de la désinformation. En mars de cette année, par exemple, le Canada a consacré 3 millions de dollars à la lutte contre la campagne de désinformation de la Russie concernant l'Ukraine. Alors, comme parlementaires, nous avons des responsabilités qui sont accrues, mais aussi des opportunités. Nos voix ont plus de résonance que jamais et nous devons choisir nos mots et nos sources d'information avec plus de soin qu'auparavant. En tant que parlementaires, nous devons également faire preuve de sagesse dans l'exercice de notre pouvoir et de légiférer en ce qui concerne la désinformation et la liberté sur Internet. Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Merci à notre collègue Christina Michaud du Canada. And next speaker is Yasmin Posio from Sweden, followed by Marta Rosique Isaltor from Spain. Please let me announce that I would close the speakers list after the next speaker. So please, in case you still want to speak in the general debate, let us know within the next 3 minutes, and then I will close the speakers list. Please, our colleague Yasmin Posio from Sweden, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Byser, on the report, though I would like to stress that gender issues should have been emphasized even more, since women's rights are human rights and they are being violated. Leaders across the world talk about the importance of including women equally in decision-making, as ministers, parliamentarians, experts, and important actors in civil society. But how shall we, as women, be able to do that when we do the majority of the unpaid domestic work, when we do not have the right to decide over our own bodies and sexuality, when we cannot freely move around in the society without fear of being harassed, abused, or murdered by men? Some countries have taken the right steps when it comes to making the lives of women more fair and free. They have put proper laws in place that ensures women safe abortions without having to risk their sexual and reproductive health and rights and their lives. Some countries have even ratified the Council of Europe's Convention on Preventing and Combating Violence Against Women. But fellow parliamentarians, women are still unfairly dying today due to lack of political will. We are being abused and murdered by men, but we are also dying since we aren't allowed safe and legal abortions. I suffer with my sisters who live in countries with restrictive laws on abortion, sisters who are being forced to pregnancies, sisters whose only solution are illegal and unsafe abortions, though they are risking their health and even their lives. I am appalled by politicians claiming to be standing up for human rights at the same time as they restrict women's sexual and reproductive health and rights. Shame on them. It is time to stop talking about human rights if you don't truly stand up for them. That is why I urge all of us to promote sexual and reproductive health and rights within our own parliaments, that we ensure legal abortions and ratify and truly implement the Council of Europe's Convention on Preventing and Combating Violence Against Women. Thank you.
Thank you very much, dear colleague. I will now close the speakers list. Thank you for the last mentions we did get. Next on our list is then Marta Rosique Isaltor from Spain, followed by our colleague David Wells from Canada.
Thank you very much for this relevant report. I would like to express my concern on the lack of respect on human rights in many occasions, and would like to bring human rights truly in the center, understanding what human rights really are, which are the rights for all human beings. The terrible war in Ukraine tells us how the war is always linked to this respect on human rights, and also shows us how the war is also linked to increased inequalities. Increased inequalities in Ukraine itself, but also in all states that can be involved in the conflict or also dependent on the conflict. Inequalities are bigger than ever right now. We still can learn from this. And I would like to express three different learnings that we should get from it. The first one is that all wars should always be condemned. All victims deserve the same treatment. The victims of Ukraine deserve the best treatment that they can have, but also the victims from the north of Africa that are going, migrating in the south of Spain, in Melilla, should have their human rights always respected. We must ensure that human rights are respected at all times. The second thing I want to express is that only through diplomacy, only through disarmament, will long-lasting peace be ensured. And the third one, which is completely linked, is that only in peace democracy will be implemented. How else can we ensure the implementation of the human rights agreements if military dependence is so strong? How can we ensure the respect on human rights for those who want to promote democratic changes to the status quo? How can we ensure the respect on human rights for those who suffer authoritarianism? How can we ensure the respect on human rights for those who are promoting, for example, a democratic process on self-determination? We must put the human rights in the center at all times. Thank you.
Thank you very much, dear colleague. Next on our speakers list is David Wells from Canada, followed by Marta Freitas from Portugal.
Dear colleagues, I'd also like to thank the rapporteur of this committee for this important report. My comments will focus on the humanitarian aspect of this crisis, specifically food security. It's becoming increasingly clear that food security is a pressing issue for the OSCE region and the world, as Ukraine, as a crucial supplier of agricultural products for many countries, is a crucial supplier. Russia and Ukraine are among the top exporting countries of the primary grains traded in the world: wheat, barley, maize, and canola. Ukraine is also the world's largest producer of sunflower oil and sunflower seeds. Russia's war on Ukraine is disrupting the livelihoods of the agricultural growing season, damaging agricultural lands as well as transport infrastructure such as roads, rail, and ports, other essential civilian infrastructure. In particular, Russian port blockades in the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov have been preventing Ukraine from exporting its agricultural produce. In addition, Russia has been deliberately putting pressure on the global food supply markets by imposing export bans on grains. While food prices were already rising prior to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, due to COVID-19 pandemic, climate shocks, and other conflicts. The UN Food and Agriculture Organization Food Price Index reached an all-time high in March 2022. We also know that rising prices in oil, natural gas, ocean freight, and fertilizers will further exacerbate food price inflation. As stated by the Director of the United Nations World Food Programme, we're facing a perfect storm. With ports blocked, trade routes cut off, and the export bans in place, many countries are facing shortages of certain staple foods. In those countries that rely on Russian and Ukrainian grains, especially low-income countries or those already impacted by food security, the situation will result in a food crisis. Port blockades in the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov must be brought to an end, not only because of their effect on Ukraine's economy, but also because of their effect on the supply of essential agricultural products to the rest of the world. This humanitarian crisis goes well beyond the borders of Ukraine. At the same time, we must also help avert catastrophic food shortages in countries that are being affected by the food insecurity as a result of this and other crises. To do so, we must urgently increase humanitarian assistance. Countries like Canada, with the capacity to help supply countries most heavily reliant on lost Ukrainian supplies, will be part of the solution. Thank you, colleagues.
Thank you very much, dear colleague. Next speaker is Marta Freitas from Portugal, followed by Leah Gazan from Canada.
Thank you, Mr. Vice-Chair. Dear colleagues, since February 24, we have been overwhelmed with the image from Ukraine showing us the atrocious suffering of men, women, children, and the elder dead. Suddenly and inexplicably were left empty-handed. More than their homes, they are losing their lives and families, victims of barbaric and unjustified invasion by a country, Russia. These people have been living in a horror scenario for 4 months, one that is taking every time that they had away from them, but still resist in the honorable defense of what they have built and of their own identity. The images of civilians leaving behind their whole lives and their history are shocking. They are falling into a void where thousands of displaced people come together in search of a new opportunity in a new country that will welcome them and offer them protection, safety, and hope of a new beginning. Dear members, that is heartbreaking. It's been more than 4 months of horror, death, torture, rape, forced deportation, and humiliation. This is an unspeakable aggression to which Europe and the world should not and must not be indifferent to. The member states are represented cannot stand and watch this attack on democracy and the rights of a nation. The very fact that we are here debating these subjects is proof of that. According to the news, Ukraine is already investigating more than 15,000 potential war crimes. All international forces must be mobilized in order to carry out and thorough investigation. This is, of course, does not exclude the need for dialogue, so that peace can be achieved between the two conflicted forces. Dear colleagues, alongside the dialogue with the authorities of the two parties at war, we must not forget to shelter the incoming Ukrainian citizens that are being forced out of their land. Every country has the social responsibility of solidarity. I would like to remind you that Portugal has already welcomed 43,000 refugees from Ukraine who have applied to the Temporary Protection Directive. Our public service had to work fast to deliver in a fast time taxpayer number, a social number, and a health number, so these displaced people can have access to the job market, school, housing, and health. We will continue to do our part. Everything in our power must be done to help refugees and to end this war as soon as possible. We cannot let more innocent blood be spilled. Thank you.
Thank you very much, dear colleague. Just for your information, we have 9 more speakers in the general debate before we come to the amendments. One speaker has withdrawn, so the next speaker is Mr. Kamil Aydin from Turkey, and followed by Maria Karapetyan from Armenia. Dear colleague, please.
Yes, thank you, Chair, for allowing me to speak, and I also would like to thank the rapporteur for such an illuminating report. And now we are currently running a session of the Committee on Democracy, Human Rights and Humanitarian Questions, a committee which is based on some core values, such as democracy, human rights, and rule of law. It's also my understanding that we have also unwritten sets of convention and rules which open the channels for unsolved problems such as reciprocal understanding, appreciation, and respect. In short, we name them as a kind of dialogue. Bearing in mind this common ground, I ultimately reject all baseless allegations of the Greek Cypriot delegate. As usual, we are sick and tired of these delegations continuing hybrid attacks against Turkey through misinformation. Diverting the facts is counterproductive. It doesn't help to achieve regional peace and prosperity. The solution of Cyprus problem can only be possible by the acceptance of the existence of the Turkish Cypriots, who have been living there for centuries. In this regard, Turkish Cypriots would like to establish a relation based on, rather than the reaction based on relationship sort of, and sovereign equality and through registering international status. Having said that, let me begin by touching upon the situation of migrants and asylum seekers in Turkey. We have largest asylum seeker population in the world, which is over 4 million. The number of the asylum seekers in Turkey is more than the population of 21 OSCE participating states. On the other hand, Turkey continues its fight against irregular migration. In 2021, our authorities captured 163,000 irregular migrants and 8,000 smugglers. In 2022, this figure has been approximately 120,000 for irregular migrants and nearly 4,000 for smugglers. In the field of migration, some countries avoid effective burden sharing and even try to pass their own responsibility to third countries by making deals. We cannot resolve this problem by loading the burden to the shoulders of third countries, especially if they are not considered as the safe countries. Responses to irregular migration and human mobility should always be in line with the international human rights law. Some people cannot even make asylum applications, and their lives are placed at risk due to pushbacks. These inhuman attitudes should be condemned, and the responsible authorities should be held accountable for these actions. Respecting the rights of migrants, refugees, and minorities is indispensable for sustainable peace, stability, and welfare in the OSCE region. Thank you.
Thank you, dear colleague. The next on our speakers list will be Maria Karapetyan from Armenia, followed by Michele Muratori from San Marino.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would like to acknowledge the work of the rapporteur of our committee. Indeed, it is of utmost importance that this report addresses the humanitarian consequences of armed conflicts. I believe the report and the resolution would be more comprehensive if it addressed all conflict contexts. Azerbaijan carried an aggressive 44-day war against Nagorno-Karabakh in 2020. Since then, Azerbaijan declares it has, quote-unquote, resolved the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, and that we should all forget the word Nagorno-Karabakh and the Armenians that live there. On international platforms such as our OSCE, this is presented by Azerbaijani members of parliament as, quote-unquote, let's turn the page of conflict. Meanwhile, at home in Azerbaijan, the president says, direct quote, Azerbaijan has resolved this conflict alone on the battlefield. If someone wants to give the Armenians living in our territory a status, I don't mind that, but let them choose a good place for that in their own country. If we see the slightest danger, we will destroy them immediately. Dear colleagues, allowing Azerbaijan to get away with this means legitimizing the use of force and war as a means of, quote-unquote, resolving conflicts. A number of international actors have acknowledged that the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict still needs a peaceful political solution and that humanitarian issues must be resolved immediately. On March 10 of this year, the European Parliament adopted a resolution on the destruction of cultural heritage in Nagorno-Karabakh. Here's what the European Parliament said. The Parliament emphasizes the need to approach the protection of historical and cultural heritage within the broader framework of conflict resolution between Armenia and Azerbaijan, and that the final definition of the status of Nagorno-Karabakh in this context calls on Azerbaijan to discard its maximalist aims, militaristic approach, and territorial claims on Armenia, and engage in good faith in negotiations under the auspices of the OSCE Minsk Group on the final status of Nagorno-Karabakh. Dear colleagues, a year and a half after the 2020 war, Azerbaijan still keeps 38 confirmed prisoners of war and refuses to release them. In the most recent statement of the chair of the delegation of the European Parliament for the relations for the South Caucasus, the representative says, on 8 March, the natural gas pipeline supplying Nagorno-Karabakh was damaged in an area under the control of Azerbaijan. Over the past weeks, Azerbaijani army loudspeakers directed at these villages have been calling on the local Armenian population to leave the area. To conclude, it is extremely important to underline that when we say the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict still needs a negotiated solution and all humanitarian issues should be resolved, we're not advocating for the continuation of the conflict. Armenia has been and will continue applying every effort for a peaceful and collaborative South Caucasus. Thank you.
Thank you, dear colleague. Next on the speakers list is Michele Muratori from San Marino, followed by Lilit Galstian from Armenia. Our colleague from San Marino.
Thank you,
please.
Vice President. If it's possible, I would like to speak in Italian. Gentile Vicepresidente Link, gentile Relatore Buser, cari colleghi. La crisi umanitaria scaturita dal recente drammatico conflitto in Ucraina ci pone di fronte ad una nuova sfida da affrontare tutti insieme. Sono ancora negli occhi di tutti noi le immagini strazianti di donne, bambini, anziani che scappano dalle zone di guerra per cercare riparo e protezione in paesi sicuri. È un'immagine che tutti noi dobbiamo tenere in mente, come tutte le immagini devastanti che abbiamo potuto vedere in tutti questi anni, come nel conflitto nel Nagorno-Karabakh, ad esempio. Purtroppo di guerre nel mondo ce ne sono ancora tante, noi abbiamo il dovere di intervenire, ognuno con le proprie possibilità e con i propri mezzi a disposizione. La crisi umanitaria degli ultimi 3 mesi, che sembra ci abbia proiettato indietro di un secolo, ci pone nella condizione di intervenire su diversi punti. Il primo è l'accoglimento dei profughi di guerra, offrire loro un rifugio sicuro e un futuro per le famiglie che si ritrovano senza più casa e affetti. Il secondo è saper tutelare e proteggere tutte quelle persone come giornalisti, attivisti della società civile che si oppongono ai governi che violano i diritti umanitari e i diritti umani. Il terzo è l'aspetto riguardante la crisi alimentare che si è innescata con il conflitto in Ucraina, che può scatenare una problematica difficile da gestire. La risposta di tutti i nostri paesi alla grandissima recente crisi umanitaria e il conseguente accoglimento dei profughi di guerra è stata senza precedenti. Anche la Repubblica di San Marino, il paese che oggi ho l'onore di rappresentare in questa assemblea, con una popolazione interna di 33.000 abitanti, ha saputo ospitare fino a 350 cittadini ucraini. Numeri esigui se rapportati ai grandi paesi, ma con un territorio di 61 km² siamo orgogliosi di aver dato un aiuto concreto, come abbiamo sempre fatto nella nostra storia. Ma abbiamo tante altre esigenze, enunciate tra l'altro perfettamente dalla pregevole relazione di Johan Buser. Ho apprezzato molto l'approccio riguardante la lotta alle fake news e credo che sia molto pertinente affrontare e approfondire il discorso, soprattutto in questo periodo di guerra. Grazie a tutti.
Thank you very much, dear colleague. Next on our speakers list is Lgbti from Armenia, followed by Robin Wagner from Germany.
Honorable Chair, dear colleagues, it's concerning that the report overlooks the severe humanitarian challenges that Armenia and Nagorno-Karabakh are currently facing. But firstly, I'd like to drive your attention on violations taking place in Armenia. Political prosecutions, implementation of special measures, disproportionate use of force by the police against peaceful protesters. Recently, by the vote of the majority, the opposition lawmakers were removed from their positions. In the absence of proper intervention, the local authorities will interpret the silence of the international organizations as approval to act freely. And the second most important issue I'd like to drive your attention. A bloody aggression unleashed by Azerbaijan and Turkey was stopped by statement, but issues concerning fundamental freedoms and the right of life still remain outstanding. Tens of thousands of Armenians from indigenous Armenian regions of Shushi and Hadrut are displaced. Their return to their homes, as stipulated in the statement, is far from being implemented. About 120 Armenian prisoners of war and civilians are still illegally detained in Azerbaijan. The testimonies reveal shocking details concerning their torture and inhuman treatment in the Azerbaijani captivity. The Azerbaijani state policy of elimination of all Armenian traces through ethnic cleansing and destruction of the Armenian historical, cultural, and religious heritage in the occupied territories of Nagorno-Karabakh is continuous. The UN International Court of Justice obliged Azerbaijan to take all measures to prevent and punish active vandalism and falsification affecting Armenian cultural heritage. Yet, contrary is a matter of fact. Azerbaijan deliberately impedes international organizations, including UNESCO's monitoring missions visit to region. Violations of international law remain unrecorded, and thousands of people are deprived of humanitarian assistance. Playing blind and mute equals to silent endorsement of the crimes being committed. To prove the opposite, OSCE has an obligation to demonstrate political will and use all the necessary tools to reach full release of Armenian Poles, to assist the conflict-affected population of Artsakh facing existential threat, preventing the prospect of ethnic cleansing. It is very important that all humanitarian consequences of the aggression unleashed by Azerbaijan and Turkey are clearly addressed in the resolutions to be adopted during the session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, dear colleague. Und jetzt freue ich mich, als nächsten Robin Wagner von meiner eigenen Delegation der Deutschen das Wort geben zu dürfen, followed by Mark de Mesmaeker from Belgium. Robin.
Vielen Dank. Mama, why do I have to suffer this pain? I always behaved well. Dear colleagues, in the meeting of the Standing Committee yesterday, our colleague from Ukraine quoted a dying child killed by Russian terror in the war of annihilation. We must stop this Russian aggression against peace in Europe, against innocent humans, against us all, and I'm very happy that this is the overall arc in the discussions in this assembly. We are facing this terrible war against Ukraine, its people and its sovereignty. But we are also facing another threat linked to it, not only against a single state, but against the idea of a continent with sovereignty of nations, free choice of alliances, and peaceful law-based order, and against democracy, human rights, and the idea of it. The world we are facing is threatened more and more by the concurrency and conflict of liberal democracies and authoritarianism, between the struggle of power of majority and human rights on the other hand. And this is what we so impressively see in Ukraine at the moment. We see Ukraine holding up the parliamentarism, the work of parliament, the rights of people, while Russia is evolving more and more to dictatorship. This conflict is not only present in Russia and Belarus, but the threats to democracy, to minority rights and to freedom are present in all our societies. We know that Russia targets our weaknesses with organized campaigns, but we create our vulnerabilities in democracy ourselves. And I'm deeply worried by the developments even in democratic societies. Let us together reduce those vulnerabilities. This is our task as parliamentarians. Because I do not want to accept a region without equal rights and chances for women, and not only rights in theory, but we must actively work for an at least equal active role for women in our societies and political systems. I do not want to accept a region where LGBTIQ community members, Jews, Muslims, Christian minorities, where members of minorities must live in fear. I do not want to accept a region without the real chance to live out freedom of expression, of political diversity, and with an anti-democratic democratic climate of fake news and disinformation. And I do not want to accept a region without independent control of those in power and independent guarantee for rule of law by a strong and independent judiciary system. I want to live in a region where human security for all is the basis for the common European security. And therefore, I thank you for this report and for your hard work in this committee on that. And I think we all should work strongly together on that in our societies and in the whole region and use the OSCE for this means.
Danke dir, Robin. Next speaker on our list is Mark de Mesmaeker from Belgium, followed by Boris Dietrich from the Netherlands.
Thank you, colleagues. These are difficult and dark hours. There are a lot of challenges in the whole of the OSCE region, and I make no exception for my own country. And we shouldn't make any exception at all if we are serious about the key OSCE documents and about our commitments that we made, that is, uphold human rights, media freedom, space for civil society, gender equality. And I join the other members in congratulating the rapporteur who did an excellent job. But, of course, the most urgent challenge now is the aggression against Ukraine and the consequences for human rights of its people. And instead of giving a theoretical speech, I would like to deliver just a short and a brief testimony. I was in Kiev beginning of April with other colleagues, days after several surrounding towns were liberated from Russian invaders. Believe me, you have to see the magnitude of the devastation. You have to smell the scorched air. You have to hear the silence in what were once vibrant communities to fully realize what happened there and what is still happening in other places. I am from a small country at the North Sea, not even a near neighbor of Ukraine. But altogether, Kiev is closer to Brussels than Cyprus or the Portuguese island of Madeira, just to name a couple of places. It is happening in our backyard on the European continent. And as a compassionate human being, what shocks me most is to see and to realize how Russian invaders show total lack of respect for the value of human life itself. That respect is at the core of human rights, the right to live. The buildings destroyed are all civilian buildings. I stood at an open mass grave behind the church of Bucha, where 300 bodies were buried, all of them civilians executed. I recorded the testimony of officials and civilians who survived. And you know what all of them said they wanted the most? That those who did this would be found and brought to justice. No revenge, justice. Indeed, there can be no impunity for these war crimes, because when there is impunity, the future looks very grim for our children and for the next generations. And in a way, I really regret that the members of Duma and Russian officials are not present to hear my accusation here and now. And somehow I hope they will hear it. The accusation that they are liars when they parrot their leader, denying the atrocities, denying that they target civilians. the accusation that they show genocidal behavior. I wish them to hear that. For sure, these are dark hours for the OSCE region, as I said, and I welcome the strong wording of the resolution. And to conclude, at the same time, the humanitarian needs are immense and will be by the start and throughout the winter season. I therefore call upon every one of us to keep this high on the agendas. It is in an effort that we will make together that we will help Ukraine and its people through these difficult times. Thank you.
Dear Mark, let me thank you very much for your clear words. Thank you very much. Next speaker on our list is our colleague Boris Dietrich from the Netherlands, followed by João Montenegro from Portugal.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The Netherlands commends the report of the rapporteur, Mr. Buzar. And I would like to highlight a topic that has not been publicly discussed as of yet from the report. It's the paragraph on respecting the rights of LGBTI people as mentioned on page number 6. As Mr. Buzar reported, we see the detrimental effect of Russian legislation on some other OSCE countries, and I'm referring to the Russian law that prohibits discussing LGBTI rights when minors are involved, especially in educational settings. We see similar legislation popping up in some states of the United States, like Florida, for instance, but also in EU countries like Poland. The delegation of the Netherlands believes that we need to stand firm and support the human rights of LGBTI people. LGBTI people should not be made invisible and should not be discriminated against. Dear member colleagues, we should condemn and prevent hate crimes against LGBTI people, such as it happened 6 years ago in Florida, in Orlando, or only 7 days ago in Oslo, Norway, at the beginning of the Pride events. LGBTI rights are human rights, and we should respect them like we should respect the human rights for all, because we are all born free and equal. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, dear Boris. Now I will give the floor to João Montenegro, and he is followed by Amina Al-Ghazadeh from Azerbaijan.
Thank you, dear Vice Chair, dear members. In April, Ukraine's Ministry of Culture reported that since the beginning of the war, 242 Russian war crimes have been documented against Ukrainian cultural heritage, specifying that crimes committed by Russian troops against this cultural heritage has been recorded in 11 regions and the capital, Kiev. As a result of the war, 94 cultural heritage sites were destroyed or damaged, including monuments of national and local importance, and identified as cultural heritage sites. Religious centers have suffered the most of the attacks. Orthodox churches, Protestant places, mosques, synagogues, memorials honoring historical people and dates from the 19th to the early 21st century, as well as a few other buildings with general valuable history. UNESCO warned last June that Ukrainian cultural heritage continues to be destroyed. UNESCO takes a dramatic account of the damage done to the cultural sector by the Russian invasion, highlighting the destruction of historical monuments, some of them dating from the 12th and 13th century. According to the balance, 3 main Ukrainian regions concentrate the damage: Donetsk, 45 sites or monuments affected, Kharkiv, 40, and Kiev, 26. Monuments built in honor of the glory of the people and the country. Dear Vice Chair, dear members, Ukraine and Russia are signatories to the 1954 Hague Convention, which determines that the protection of cultural heritage in armed conflict. So far, the 7 Ukrainian sites classified as UNESCO World Heritage has not been harmed in the attacks. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, dear colleague. We have now our last not least speaker on the list, Amina Agazadeh from Azerbaijan. After that, we will move on to the amendments. Please.
Dear colleagues, the occupation of the territories of Azerbaijan for nearly 3 decades was a graphic illustration of the deficiency of accountability mechanism for serious violation of international law, including international humanitarian law and human rights law. Currently, Armenia maintains provocative rhetorics containing groundless territorial claims against Azerbaijan. It still promotes the idea of status for a part of the internationally recognized territory of Azerbaijan. So-called Nagorno-Karabakh, its fiction entity set up by Armenia in the formerly occupied territories of Azerbaijan. This entity was denied any recognition by the entire international community. It was ultimately nothing other than the product of aggression, ethnic cleansing, and racial discrimination against Azerbaijan, and a cover-up for Armenian almost 3 decades of occupation of my country's territories in violation of international law, well-known resolution of the UNSC and the OSCE principles and commitments. As to the issue of human rights, respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms must be accorded on an equal and discriminatory basis throughout society and state within the constitutional and legal framework. This is what our shared OSCE principles and commitments demand. Azerbaijan is resolute to reintegrate its citizens of Armenian origin residing in conflict-affected territories into its political, social, economic space, guaranteeing the same rights and freedoms with all the citizens of Azerbaijan, regardless of their ethnic, religious affiliation. The Constitution of the Republic of Azerbaijan provides a solid legal framework in this regard. As to the issue of Armenian detainees, Azerbaijan released all Armenian prisoners of war right after the trilateral statement of 10 November 2020 was signed. Those Armenian detainees remaining in Azerbaijan's custody are those whom Armenia illegally transferred into the territory of Azerbaijan in order to commit acts of sabotage and provocation after the signing of the trilateral statement. They are liable under the criminal law of Azerbaijan. And as to reference to the president of Azerbaijan, indeed, the conflict has been resolved via political and military means. This is a reality, but this was due to refusal by Armenia over the past 3 decades to engage in substantive negotiation and gross violation by Armenia on fundamental norms and principles of international law. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, dear colleague. And now it's up to me to make a correction. I did, unfortunately, forget one speaker, Mr. Makopoulos from Greece. Dear colleague, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. The crisis in Ukraine is significant, is something very important. However, it should not make us forget the crisis in the field of human rights in countries that operate a new imperial logic, fake democracies that threaten neighboring countries. There are many Russias on the horizon. There are many Putins, countries and leaders that do not respect the rights of minorities, citizens with different sexuality, the rights and the law in the sea, states that do not respect religious rights, countries that are acting like bully guys in big regions, countries whose delegations probably are inside this hall. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, dear colleagues. I close the general debate. We will now move to consider the amendments. We have a little, only a little time which is at our disposal, but I think we can do some amendments at least and make best use of it. 16 amendments have been tabled and copies of the amendments have been made available to you. Please, the correct version is entitled AS22 DRS3 amend. So please make sure to have the right copy. In discussing amendments, I will call the proposer of the amendment first and then an opponent of the amendment. I will then ask the sponsor of the draft resolution, in this case Mr. Büser, to react with his opinion if needed. We have 1 minute to propose the amendment and 1 minute to oppose the amendment, and therefore we now go to the text. We are also required, dear colleagues, to vote on every paragraph. Therefore, we begin with the paragraphs without amendments. This is paragraphs 1 to 3. I think we can take 1 to 3 together. Does anyone want a separate vote on any of these paragraphs? I don't see that. Then we can have a vote on all these 3 paragraphs together. And by the way, when we vote, I think you agree when it's a very clear picture, we don't make an individual count. We would only count if there's a mixed picture. Okay, so then I would put paragraph 1 to 3 to the vote. Anyone against? Those in favor? 1 to 3. Those in favor of paragraph 1 to 3, please show. Thank you. Abstentions? Abstentions? I don't see anyone. Okay. Then let's move to amendment number 1. I call our colleague Steve Cohen from the United States to propose amendment number 1.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This amendment would just make clear that Russia's war affects more areas and includes their blockade of the Black Sea and the inability of Ukraine to export its wheat. There are literally hundreds of thousands of people in Somalia who may starve to death because of the lack of the exportation of that grain. I think Mr. Wells of Canada addressed this earlier in his remarks, and I would try to incorporate by reference what he said. But this is a humanitarian crisis that Putin has brought as a byproduct of this war, and I urge us to adopt this amendment.
Thank you, Steve. Does anyone wish to speak against the amendment? I don't see anybody wanting to speak against. What is our rapporteur's opinion of the amendment? He agrees, so we can put it to a vote. Will all those in favor of amendment 1 please raise their cards? Thank you very much. That's very clear. Or those against? Thank you. Abstentions? Okay. The amendment is carried, is adopted. We will now vote on paragraph 4. Anyone against paragraph 4? The amended one? No. In favor? Please show. In favor of paragraph 4? Thank you. Abstentions? Paragraph 4 is agreed. We move to amendment number 2. I call again Steve Cohen from the United States delegation to propose amendment number 2.
Thank you, Mr. Link. Besides, this also has been discussed thoroughly. Russia's pattern of behavior in attacking civilians, and in particularly egregious children with rape and murders and deportations back to, not deportations, but taking them back to Russia is borders on genocide. And I think we need to talk about these reports of violence by the Russian troops, and I would urge the adoption of amendment number 2.
Thank you very much. Does anyone wish to speak against the amendment? I don't see anybody. What is the rapporteur's opinion? Thumbs up. Okay, I shall now put amendment 2 to the vote. Will all those in favor please raise their voting cards? Thank you very much. Objections? Abstentions? Amendment 2 is adopted. Now, dear colleagues, with a view to our agenda and with a view also to the invitation of the President and your agenda, we would stop here at this point, continuing tomorrow with amendment number 3. And I thank you very much. Let me briefly say, please don't be surprised. I cannot be here personally tomorrow for the next meetings of the committee. I have to be back in the Parliament in Berlin. You know that business. And then I try to fly back here on Tuesday. But I'm very glad and happy that Lord Alfred Dubs is chairing instead of me, as Søren Mauborgne is not re-elected, unfortunately, he's not here, and I will be in Berlin, but Alfred Dubs will be chairing. He's sitting here, one of the most experienced colleagues here in our OSCE EPA, and I thank him very much for that. And I hope to see you all again on Tuesday by noon, flights providing and airports permitting. Thank you very much. See you soon.